So, okay, let's talk about voting. Is that effective? And I have a hard time believing that voting is effective, honestly. And this is where I'm going to kind of lose some people. Um, I wouldn't recommend not voting, but this is what I want to say. I wouldn't say don't vote, because here's why. I think one single vote does not matter. My vote does not matter. In fact, I've never voted in any election whatsoever, ever, not even school elections, let alone for president. Why? Because it doesn't matter. One person doesn't matter. But if I were to get on here on a public platform in front of my students and recommend them all to not vote and try to influence that way, well, certainly then that would actually influence more votes and would weigh more heavily, as you can see the math, the way it works out. So I wouldn't recommend doing that. I'm not saying that. I'm not advocating. But I will say that I don't vote. Well, why don't I vote? Because mathematically, it doesn't make sense. And then I ask my students this. I say, look, let's think about the voting at all. Okay, we thought about whether it's effective and whether it's efficient, whether it makes a difference. And I ask them, what is a vote anyway? Do you have a right to vote or do you have a duty to vote? Which do you think that is? And they're kind of perplexed by that. They know that it's often, formed in terms of right to vote. So they're like, yeah, it's got to be that. But they also feel like, well, it's kind of a duty to vote in some way. And I say, well, it's a right to vote, not a duty to vote. It's not a duty, because a duty means that it's an obligation. Okay? It is not a duty for you to vote. So in other words, if you were required to vote, that would be a duty to vote. If you don't have a civic duty, you might have a moral duty to vote, whatever that stems from, but then you'd have to defend what it means to have a moral duty to vote. But you don't have a civic duty to vote. There's nothing in law that requires you to vote. You're not obligated. You're not going to be put in jail because you didn't vote. But you have a right to vote. And you can either exercise that right or refrain from exercising that. Just like freedom of speech. I'm not required to speak. It's not a duty that I do so, but I have a right to do it if I would like to. So I can either exercise that duty or just opt not to exercise it. So voting is like that. And there's a difference between positive rights and negative rights. Positive rights, let's see if I can remember this again. Positive, I think one is where the state must give you this thing. But a negative right is where the state cannot restrict you from exercising this thing. So I think negative right would be the correct classification for right to vote. Because if it were a positive right, it would, let's think about this with respect to guns, like gun rights. Guns would not be a positive right because the government's not required to supply you with a gun, but it's a negative right such that if you wanted to avail yourself and purchase a gun, you have the opportunity to do that. In other words, they won't stop you. Much the same with freedom of speech, freedom to assemble, freedom of religion. They're not required to give you these things freedom of speech or freedom of the press. They're not required to supply you with a newspaper and sign you up and get you an editorship position so that you can exercise your freedom of speech. And if they don't, they're in violation of that. It's a negative right such that they can't stop you if you wanted to exercise it. So I think voting, the right to, is probably a negative right, but it is a little bit of a positive right as well, only because they do go out of their way to open up booths, to provide mail-in ballots and that sort of thing. But in the actual essence of the thing, I think it's a negative right because they're not actually required to do those things. They're just making it easier. They can't stop you if you wanted to vote. So it's a mix. It's interesting. In any case, you are not required to vote.